Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tata Literature Live, the 11th annual Mumbai International Litfest and the first one to be completely digital, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects. This session is presented by Citi. 60 years after a bunch of teenagers in Liverpool started making counterculture music, they are still regarded as one of the most influential bands of all time. To help us decipher the Beatlemania across the universe and time are our esteemed guests this afternoon. Popular writer, memoirist, and author of recently launched book 1234 The Beatles in Time, Mr. Craig Brown, in conversation with award-winning radio host and producer Hrishi K. The conversation will be followed by a quick Q&A segment, so we look forward for questions and responses from audiences through their comment boxes of their viewing platform. Do feel free to do so even during the session. Let's come together and welcome Craig Brown and Hrishi K.
Craig, wonderful to see you. And like they always ask of an Englishman, how's the weather?
Actually, the weather today is rather nice. It's kind of sunny but cold.
You know, any connection with the Fab Four is incomplete for us Indians without the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and the Hrishikesh visit story. And really, it starts a lot before they actually came down to Hrishikesh. And eventually, like your excellent book, 1234, The Beatles in Time, talks about, he came to be a father figure and almost replaced Brian Epstein, who was their papa for a prolonged period of time. So I think let's just start with that.
Yes. Well, they first went to see him when he was in London in 1967, and I think it was August. And then the Maharishi had a session in Wales, and so they went to Wales for the weekend. And during that weekend, Brian Epstein died completely suddenly, probably suicide. And this obviously greatly upset them because he really was like a father figure to them. And I mean, for instance, they'd hardly ever traveled anywhere without him since becoming famous. And when they went out, this is before they realized that he had died. So on this, I think the Saturday night or the Friday night, they went out to a Chinese restaurant. And they, at the end of it, they were with, say, 4 friends and the 4 Beatles. At the end of it, they realized they didn't have any money because they'd stopped, rather like the royal family, they'd stopped carrying money. And so they didn't have any money to pay the bill with. And this was this was almost a premonition of what it would be like, life would be like without Brian Epstein. Anyway, then the next day they heard that he had died. And the Maharishi kind of stepped in. He said, well, I'm your father now. Now, some people thought, like Marianne Faithfull, who was there at the time, thought that was very presumptuous of him. And so I think the Maharishi is seen in different ways by different people, like a lot of the figures around the Beatles. Some thought he was kind of cashing in on them. And then some people thought he was entirely sincere and wanted to look after them. And probably the truth is a bit of both, that he was an opportunist, but he also, in quite a lot of ways, was good for the Beatles.
And his effect, Craig, his effect was seen in different manners with each of them. For example, you do say in the book that in that Hrishikesh trip, when they came into the ashram, it was actually Ringo and his wife who left first, followed by Paul, and John and George ended up staying right till the end. Yes. So I get a sense that Ringo and Paul were not so much into it. Paul, of course, being very pragmatic, and he continues to be to the day. So it's obvious that George was very into it. And because of him, a lot of them, the others were willing to try it and give transcendental meditation a shot.
Yes, it was Patty, George's wife, who originally saw the Maharishi. She got George into it. He immediately took to it. Obviously, sparked something within inside him, and he remained completely devoted to India and Eastern religion for the rest of his life. Ringo was the most kind of the most English, you could say, of the Beatles. He actually took he'd been very ill as a child, so this isn't entirely a kind of Philistine portrait of him, but he had been very ill at the child, so he was nervous of spicy food and that sort of thing. But he did pack a whole lot of Heinz baked beans in his suitcase to take to India, so he was slightly dreading it, I think. And then I think he couldn't get into the meditation at all. Paul, actually, though, as you say, he's the most pragmatic. And perhaps because he's pragmatic, I think he still meditates to this day, but it's in a very loose way. It's more like mindfulness, I suppose. John had other reasons for staying out there, and that it was very much a crisis point in his life, not just with Brian having died, but he was basically planning to leave Cynthia and Yoko, and Cynthia was out there with him, but he was going to the sort of local store each day and getting daily letters from Yoko secretly. And so he realized that something was going to be happening when he got home. And so I think that might have been a reason for him staying and putting, whereas, I think probably George would have stayed longer. But then the whole thing sort of ended in tears, because I think the Maharishi, probably unfairly, it's always very difficult to tell the truth behind these things, but I think unfairly, and prompted by one of their sort of hangers-on, the Beatles hangers-on, the Maharishi was accused of behaving improperly to one of the women there. And I think this gave John a kind of excuse for leaving, and so they sort of left in a temper. They just called a cab and left. And people said the Maharishi looked very forlorn, because I think he had been doing his best, and they were obviously a great feather in his cap, because they were the foremost famous people in the world, really, at that time. And so it ended sadly. But the Maharishi was quite a kind of ebullient character, and he later went on tour with the Beach Boys in America. So he lived to fight another day.
He did, and Donovan, Mick Jagger, they all flocked to him eventually. So it was quite a robust business that he had going there as far as spirituality is concerned. There's no doubt about that. It's also interesting that you would refer to one person in the coterie who actually, for the lack of anything less dramatic, poisoned their minds against the Maharishi. And that leads me to the next bit that I want to explore, the hangers-on and the sycophants. And this guy was, in particular, the one who was involved in the Maharishi case, was, if I'm not mistaken, somebody of Greek descent. He eventually went on to be part of the company Apple, and your book describes it, and I urge everybody out there to go and pick it up. Some of it is ridiculous. Talks about all these ideas that he was trying to get patented, didn't patent even a single one of them, basically was spending the Beatles' money in Apple Corporation. And almost like a local village electrician, he would come in with a few tools and pretend to be a hotshot scientist. So let's talk about them being exploited, willingly so sometimes, Craig, during that phase.
Yeah, well, I think one thing I had to keep reminding myself while I was writing the book was quite how young they were. So they were, I mean, George celebrated his 25th birthday in India. And so only a few years before, he'd just been, another kid from Liverpool. And so I think you can you can't really blame them for all these people wanting something from them, and you can't blame them for being fooled. And what was surprising was, in a way, was that John, who always seemed the kind of canniest and hardest of the Beatles, was in some ways, especially by this character Magic Alex Mardas, the Greek, he was the one who was taken in by Magic Alex. Magic Alex had, I mean, he could just about change a plug, I think, but he didn't. He had come over, I think, to England originally as an electrician, but he couldn't do much more than sort of household maintenance. But he, actually, I have a list in the book of the things that he convinced.
Hilarious.
The things that he convinced the Beatles. These inventions. He said, "Well, if you employ me, and give me enough money, I can come up with these inventions." I won't read them all, but one was an X-ray camera that could see through walls. One was a force field that envelops any building in colored air, rendering it invisible. So you could just make things invisible. Solar-powered electric guitar. I guess that might be made now. Maybe he was prophetic in that way. And a paint that makes objects invisible. A house that hovers in the air, suspended on an invisible beam. Special paint that changes color at the flick of a switch. A device for preventing records being taped off the radio by sending out a series of high-pitched squeals, because they were worried about copyright. Anyway, so and as well as a huge new studio, they gave him money to design. And then when they moved into the studio, it was terrible. Every time the central heating came on, it was sort of making a huge noise and all that kind of thing. But he kept them, he obviously had some kind of charm, and he'd always go around in a sort of white laboratory coat as if he was a real scientist. Anyway, John was taken in by him for really a long time, and never, I think, never fully sort of shook him off. And there were other hangers-on, of course, especially, I think, when they started the Apple organization, which was another product of Brian Epstein's death. They wanted to kind of become businessmen, but without knowing or caring anything about business. So they wanted a kind of closed shop. They wanted a record label. They wanted independence, I suppose, from corporations, but they didn't know how to do it themselves and really didn't have the kind of time or inclination or energy to do it themselves. And so at that point, a whole lot of people flooded in, who wanted to be fashionable with the Beatles and see them as their friends, and also just wanted free money, I think. And, Apple jolly nearly brought them to their heels, I think, financially.
Yeah, there are a couple of portions in the book that I urge you guys to go and check out. This whole phase when they were being ripped off because of Apple Corporation, there is a particular point in time when George Harrison asks all the staff at Apple to open their doors for Hell's Angels, which is the biker gang, to come in and just live off the office. And each time, the Greek gentleman that Craig refers to came up with an invention, something ridiculous, ludicrous. The boys, each one of the Fab Four would say, "I'd have me one." And of course, they'd never have one because nothing really was invented. I want to complete that Hrishikesh story. I want to come back to it because I just realized we didn't talk about the music that came out of there. You do say that a lot of the White Album was recorded during their stay in Hrishikesh. So they were, with their acoustic guitars, giving it a bit of a bash and creating some music.
I think it was an amazingly creative time. I mean, first because they didn't have much else going on. And there weren't autograph hunters everywhere or all the normal stuff. There weren't nightclubs, but also there weren't hard drugs, and they were all, particularly John, but they were all doing acid and heroin at that time. And I think there was a bit of dope out there, but basically, so that sort of cleaned them up in some ways. And it was a very productive time. Just going, Ringo compared it to a holiday camp, and in some ways, it was in a kind of relaxing way. And so they did a lot of the White Album. The famous songs are Dear Prudence, Bungalow Bill, Across the Universe, I'm So Tired. I mean, there's one thing I discovered, which was that John, who had really liked it at Hrishikesh at first, did a song called Child of Nature with very kind of loving, peace on earth kind of lyrics. But when he got back, he changed it to Jealous Guy. He changed all the lyrics, and it is so the tune was Jealous Guy, but the meaning entirely changed. So in a way, when he got back to England, he became the old John, you know, kind of cynical rather than idealistic.
Yeah, speaking of another India connection, I mean, and Craig does talk about this in 1, 2, 3, 4, is that when George Harrison came back from India, Patty, his voice, and Craig says so, his wife, Patty said to a friend that maybe he was a little too influenced by Bhagwan Shri Krishna, the Lord Krishna. And as you know that, you know, Krishna was involved in the Ras Leela, was surrounded by the Gopiya. And George felt that because he was a Krishna Bhakt, a devotee of Krishna, it gave him a bit of a leeway or leverage to be, you know, a bit of a player as far as that is concerned. Not very conducive to a marriage, eh? The smooth functioning of a marriage, Craig.
No, and I think George, for the rest, from what people have told me, George, throughout his life was, as you say, a player, much more so than the other three. So though he tends to be seen as well, he was the most spiritual of the Beatles, but he was a kind of playboy figure. Yeah,
he was. Okay, all of you, please, the last 10 minutes of the session is going to involve questions from you. So please use the chat button, put in your questions there on chat along with your name, and we're happy to take them with Craig Brown in the last 10 minutes. I'm just thinking, you know, your book kicks off, and then you come back to it at particular points. The circus that has become their hometown, which is Liverpool, and you go through these tours, and you come across these tour guides and these plaques. You know, there are plaques all over for everything, even things of not great consequence. And you do say tongue-in-cheek in a lot of occasions, saying, you know, what is this stuff that's happening? Not very fond of those tours, eh? And you've taken quite a few of them.
Well, I'm in two minds about the tours. The National Trust, which looks after all of the sort of grand houses, usually stately homes of England, you know, Windsor Castle and that sort of thing, Blenheim Palace. They took over the John and Paul's childhood homes in Liverpool 10 or 15 years ago. Now and maybe a little bit more, because I went there about 10 years ago and went round them before I thought of doing a book. And there is something very moving about it. I mean, so I support the idea that these buildings should be, these small, modest houses should be open, because you realize the Beatles came from very modest backgrounds and then became this great kind of world force in music. And as I was saying, foremost famous people in the world, really, at that point. And it's rather moving to see where they composed I Want to Hold Your Hand, or that kind of thing. However, they, at the same time, there is something artificial about the houses, because the interiors, of course, both houses have been lived in by many people since the Beatles and before being taken up by the National Trust. And so, and as all houses of that type, or almost all houses in England, they would have been modernized since. So the wallpaper would be different, all the kitchen implements would be different, the dustbins would be different. But the National Trust have got sort of replicas of all the things that they think, dustbins which looked rather like period dustbins, all that sort of thing, the kind of pictures they might have had on the wall. So it is artificial. And at the same time, the guides are very precious about it. So you're not allowed to take in tape recorders or cameras. You have to leave cameras at the door, iPhones at the door. And it's all a little bit reverential. And one of them, in fact, both, they're husband and wife. One does the John's house and one does Paul's. And they noticed that I was taking notes, and they tried to stop me taking notes. But the great thing about being a writer is you always have the last laugh, because however embarrassing an event, you can always write about it and, and turn it into comedy. So it's a sort of magical profession like that. So I had the last laugh, I think.
The interpretation of Beatles songs and their lyrics in particular, I mean, it's so true when you write in your book saying a lot of them were just, drug-induced release, especially in the latter part of their career when they were on LSD, a fair amount of hash and things like that. And a song like I'm a Walrus, for example, or Revolution, some of it even gibberish, being interpreted as some divine voice by some people.
Yes.
Anarchy by others, if you look at Manson, and
Yes.
How people would hang on to every single word, which often had dangerous consequences, Craig. I'd like you to talk about that.
Yes, well, I mean, it goes back, I suppose, to John in particular. When he was a schoolboy, he was quite a keen reader, and he loved the nonsense verse of Edward Lear and Alice in Wonderland. He loved Lewis Carroll. And so he liked the whole idea of English nonsense. And so it wasn't entirely because of drugs. He kind of knew what he was doing with these nonsense things, and he would write nonsense poems as a boy. However, then he once got a letter, I suppose in about 1966, from actually someone I know, a friend of mine called Stephen Bailey, who was at John's old school in Liverpool. And Stephen Bailey, then just 14 years old or something, wrote that the teacher, because obviously John was the most famous old pupil, the teacher was teaching the lyrics Beatles lyrics in English class. And so John Lennon read this letter, and he was always very good at writing back. He wasn't lazy at all. He used to write long letters to fans. He wrote back to Stephen Bailey, it's a 2-page letter, asking how all the teachers were and that kind of thing. But also saying this idea had prompted him to put really nonsensical lyrics, to make a song full of nonsense, so that with the idea that it would be taught at his old school. So in a funny way, he was poking fun at the school, but also channeling this love of nonsense. And so very soon after, he wrote I Am the Walrus. And of course, if you hear a song like I Am the Walrus, it's been interpreted in lots of ways. But it does, because you hear it so often, say everyone hears it, say, 10 times a year for the last 50 years, and you hear it all around the place, it takes on whatever meaning you want it to have. And so there is a power to nonsense. Now, as you were saying, that power can go wrong in that most famously Charles Manson, and particularly with the song Helter Skelter. He was obviously a madman, mad and bad. And he interpreted the lyrics of Helter Skelter as showing that there was going to be a violent revolution and that throats were going to be cut. He then tied it in with the Moors' heavyweight sort of lyrics, or nastier lyrics, like Piggies, which was a George Harrison song, which was more openly sort of anti-capitalist and maybe bloodthirsty, and as you said, revolution. But it does mean that anyone can use Beatles lyrics to whatever, especially the more nonsensical ones, the more abstract ones. They can use them to whatever end they want, and which is both good and certainly in the Manson case bad. There's another chapter in the book about this idea that went round and still persists in some little quarters today, that Paul McCartney had died, I think it's about 1968, and that he'd been replaced by an actor who looked a bit like Paul. And people who wanted, I can't remember the particular lyrics, but people who wanted, there were lots of weird justifications. For instance, I think most famously, the Car on the Abbey Road cover has the registration number 28 if, and the people say, well, that's because Paul McCartney would have been 28 if he had lived. And the four figures of the Beatles, it's meant to be a kind of Indian funeral cortege. You know, John is in white and George is in black and that kind of thing. But they also went to lyrics to find this justification. And like all conspiracy theories, if you look hard enough, you will find evidence for anything.
Right.
Anyway.
And lyrically speaking, I mean, you look at a song like Hey Jude, and John, in effect, thought that Paul McCartney had written that song about him. Whereas I leave you to tell the story, there is a Julian-Lennon connection, which is
yes.
John's son from his marriage to Cynthia.
Yes. So Cynthia and John had just broken up. John had gone off with Yoko. Cynthia was very upset. Julian, I think, was about 6 or 7 years old. And Paul was driving down. He lived in London, and he was driving to the country where Cynthia was in the old Lennon's old house with Julian. And Paul, driving down, was thinking of Julian, who he'd always been very fond of, and John and had played with. Paul at that stage didn't have children, and he was very good at playing with Julian. And John had sort of not. Probably because he didn't come from a happy family. He didn't have his father had been elsewhere. He didn't really know how to be a father, and he'd say to Paul, "But how do you do this?" And so there was already a relationship between Paul and Julian. Anyway, he wanted to write some song of consolation for Julian, and the words of Hey Jude came into his head. But John, being quite a solipsist, thought it was about him. Actually, there's another thing tying in with the nonsense that John had said. Paul had written this line: "The moment you need is on your shoulder. The movement you need is on your shoulder." I can't, which doesn't really mean anything. But John said, "No, keep that. It doesn't matter if." And I think it is true of pop songs. It doesn't really matter whether they mean something. The meaning emerges. And Paul now, you can see him on YouTube when he sings Hey Jude. He says when he gets to that line, he's always thinking of John, and you can see him kind of choking up about it. And so that little, the line which doesn't really mean anything suddenly meant the most of anything in the song.
Yep. And, you know, Eleanor Rigby, of course, you know, there have been reams of newsprint written, classes taken about who's the real Eleanor Rigby, you know, who's the father, who's the preacher. And you do cover it in the book, wonderfully so.
Yes, I was pleased, actually, because I'm great friends with Eleanor Bron, who was the actress who was in Help, who sort of co-starred with the Beatles in Help. And I heard, I think it was Paul on Desert Island Discs, or Paul being interviewed on a radio show, and he said, "Oh well, we got Eleanor from Eleanor Bron." And so I said, "Oh well, Paul's just." I said to Eleanor, because I saw her sort of 2 days later, I said, "Oh, Paul's just said it was you," and so she was quite pleased by that because she'd heard sort of rumours. But actually, if you go to the if you go on a Beatles tour, all the guides are there, and there's a gravestone to the Rigby family, and then I think there's Eleanor on one gravestone and Rigby on another. It's a bit like I was saying about conspiracy theories. You can always find these things and all the different characters in the song, but the different tour guides are all giving different interpretations of this song, and it is quite funny, you know, that this, what was after all just a pop song, has got this great kind of army of theologians, in a way, debating these words, which quite often just came together by chance, or because they rhymed, or they fitted in some way, and weren't designed to mean any great thing.
Craig, your book again delves into their partners, their wives in great detail, starting off with childhood sweethearts. And I really enjoyed the portion when Paul gets close not only to Jane Asher, but also to her family, and lives with her in the family house for a while. And he himself says to date that he grew culturally so much because of his stint there in that particular house. So let's now talk about spouses, wives, starting with Paul McCartney and Jane Asher.
Yeah, I think Jane Asher. I think everyone fantasizes about themselves as a Beatle, like everyone has a favorite Beatle and that kind of thing. And I have a bit in the book saying that if I could be any Beatle at any one time, it would be Paul living with Jane Asher in her family house in Wimpole Street, kind of smart part of London. Her family were very cultured. Her father was a very intelligent doctor who actually invented, I discovered, he invented the term Munchausen's disease, and was a witty writer in the British Medical Journal and that kind of thing. The mother was taught, I think, at Royal College of Music, and had actually taught George Martin the oboe 15 years before. And they were very kind of welcoming family. Jane Asher, obviously very kind of pretty and nice personality. I write for Private Eye, and she's slightly involved with Private Eye, so I've met her a couple of times. And so it was a perfect time for Paul. The others had moved to the country. Two of them were married, so they were kind of busy elsewhere. He was right in the centre of London, so he could go and see concerts. So he'd go to classical concerts as well as pop concerts. They were a great reading household. Jane had either one or two brothers, and they had sort of very civilized sort of arguments and debates about different, politics and literature at supper time. And he could also use the downstairs room, which had a piano in it. And so he had this amazing flourishing of talent. Some of his most famous songs, like Yesterday, were written at Jane Asher's house. And this went on for a few years until they broke up. And I think that it was amazingly productive, because it just expanded his horizons. And a lot of the things which people think of John as the experimentalist, but actually it was, more often than not, it was Paul who was reading the books and going to sort of strange composers like John Cage for inspiration. And then he would hand it on to John, who would probably sort of ran with it further. And then the others, Cynthia Lennon, I find a attractive figure, because she married John secretly, actually, because the Beatles had just become famous, and so they didn't want to, and they were kind of obviously sort of like a boy band now. They didn't want to stop their fans from loving them by revealing that they were married. And so she was always slightly in the background and kind of loyal to John. And then John goes off with Yoko. So it's a sad story, that sad, but I suppose inevitable story for Cynthia. Yeah, so their girlfriends are an interesting area. I think also the fans. I have quite a lot of the book is devoted to the different fans around the world and people's fantasies that they were going to marry one of the Beatles. I think most girls, between 10 and 16, were at that time were sort of thinking, well, which one am I going to marry? And they really, a lot of their fan letters really did think, well, they'll probably drop round one day, or well, I'll see them in a shop, and they'll fall in love, and then we'll marry. And so the Beatles were subject to, like I was saying, my fantasy of being Paul and living in Wimpole Street, but everyone was fantasizing about them in some way. Even experienced politicians, they wanted to be close to the Beatles, to be more popular, or to show that they were modern and could understand youth, all that kind of thing.
Well, Craig's book, which is 1234, The Beatles in Time, has this extraordinary bit of writing. And when you read it, if you read it, you will appreciate what I'm talking about, where he actually describes moment to moment, almost like a film screenplay, the breakup of Cynthia Lennon and John Lennon. I mean, I will leave him to tell the story. But just the sense of betrayal that she felt. And also, you know, Yoko Ono is still looked upon by a lot of people as the reason the Beatles broke up. She did come from wealth, but that didn't stop her from wanting to be the center of attention or wanting to have John in her life, quite desperately so. So talk about that sense of betrayal that Cynthia felt, and you know, how the Lennon-Yoko relationship went from being letters in Hrishikesh to, you know, her just moving in with him.
Yes, I mean, I suppose this is the most controversial area of the book, because a lot of people are kind of devoted to Yoko. And they see her as the widow of John, you know, keeping his flame alive, both of which are true. But I couldn't disguise my own distrust of her, and so I thought, well, I might as well just go for it rather than being sort of on the fence. I think she, certainly at the beginning, you know, as you say, she came from a very, very rich family, like the British royal family. She, you know, they had servants who would leave on their knees. I think her parents had sort of 60 servants. That's not. She's not to blame for that, but she did have this sense of entitlement, I think. And as far as I can see, she always pretended she didn't know one Beatle from another before she met them. But actually, a lot of people have said she knew exactly what she was doing, and she was targeting John. And she would just, even when John and Cynthia were together, and Cynthia didn't know anything about Yoko, she would suddenly jump into the back of the car with them, and because she had persuaded John to put a show of hers on in the gallery, and so she was unbelievably pushy, and she would just turn up in the country house. She would just turn up at the door and that sort of thing. And then when Cynthia came back one day to their house in Sunningdale, Yoko had just moved in without any kind of warning. I mean, you can exaggerate the unpleasantness of it, because obviously any marriage which ends in divorce has, you know, uncomfortable moments. But I felt that there was a sort of sense of ruthlessness about Yoko, and yes, and then I also feel with Yoko that she encouraged John's sense of self-pity, and so his lyrics became more kind of morose and self-important, and they lost their sense of fun. And though I wouldn't go so far as to say that she broke up the Beatles, because I think that was going to happen, because they was four such strong individual personalities, and they had so much pressure on them. And they were taking, particularly in John's case, a lot of drugs. And so they were already fracturing. However, it didn't help matters when she moved into the record studio on a bed, when they never had their wives or their spouses in the studio, and she was just there. And John was she would then, you know, request things in the studio, and John had to ask the others for them. And so she was divisive. I think she probably accelerated the Beatles breakup by a few months, but I wouldn't blame her for breaking them up.
I want to talk about the cultural significance in terms of what they wanted to project to the world at large. You see, when they started off, you know, these were four kids from Liverpool. They were all well scrubbed, you know, hair in place, no dandruff, their suits, and, you know, looked upon as boys you can take home to mama. And then come the Rolling Stones, which is Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And it might interest you to know that in a previous edition of this very festival, Tata Lit Live, I was in conversation with Sam Cutler, who's the tour manager for the Rolling Stones, and he told us these incredible stories, extraordinary stories of what used to happen backstage or at Rolling Stones tours. So they were the big bad boys of rock and roll. But it irked John, and you say this in the book, because he wanted to be the guy who was the rebel with or without a cause. And he had this feeling that actually it's Mick Jagger and Keith Richards are the ones who went to proper public schools, and enjoyed a upper middle class existence. And here were they, representative of middle class England, as it were. So talk about this whole phenomenon. And of course, we all know that Jagger himself was very, very competitive.
Yes, well, it was funny because actually the Beatles in Hamburg, before they were famous, were pretty kind of rowdy. They were more like the Rolling Stones later. They would fight on stage, they'd eat on stage, they'd turn their backs to the audience, they'd sort of make jokes, they'd play songs which went on for 20 minutes. And it was really Brian Epstein who tidied them up, because and kind of rightly, because he realized that if they were going to appeal, this was a year or two before the Stones, if they were going to kind of break into a big public, they had to kind of look the part and do the job professionally. And so John quite willingly went along with that. But then, of course, it was annoying for them because though actually they they'd got the Rolling Stones their first record deal. They'd recommended them to the record boss who'd missed out on them, and they wrote the Rolling Stones' first single, and so they had kind of sponsored the Stones. And then suddenly the Stones were doing whatever they wanted and had become famous for being these kind of yob figures. And as you say, they hadn't actually gone to public school, but Jagger had gone to the London School of Economics. Keith Richards had been the head Boy Scout, and they'd been in this school choir and things like that. And so you can see why it would have annoyed John. And in the book, I do chart the kind of rivalry of the Stones and the Beatles. And even now, people say, I remember when I was saying to people, I'm doing a book about the Beatles, people would take great pride in saying, oh, well, I've always preferred the Stones. It's still a sort of badge of honor to prefer the Stones over the Beatles, or sometimes the other way around. But someone, I think Marianne Faithfull, said that Mick Jagger was always kind of slightly, it was rather like a Renaissance court, that he was the sort of lowlier prince. So Mick Jagger and Paul McCartney were friends, but it was always Mick Jagger who would go to Paul's house, not the other way round. It would, and I think Paul has mentioned this, but a lot of if you chart when the Beatles records come out and Rolling Stones records come out, the Rolling Stones are always about 6 months after the Beatles. So the Beatles tend to be the pioneers. So the Beatles do All You Need Is Love, and then a few months later the Rolling Stones do the song We Love You. So it's always a bit of catch up for the Rolling Stones. So I'd say one argument in favor of the Rolling Stones, it's an odd thing about the Beatles, there are very few Beatles songs you can actually dance to, except for some of their early ones. Whereas obviously the Rolling Stones, there's hardly any, maybe Angie or something you couldn't dance to. So the Rolling Stones, they're a much more limited band, but what they do, it's kind of dance songs, they do really well.
Any conversation about the Beatles would be incomplete. Any conversation about John Lennon would be incomplete without Aunt Mimi. And this is John's aunt, who pretty much brought him up because his mother passed away in a car accident very early on, and Craig describes that in the book. Quite a remarkable character, didn't he? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, I think for a long time people saw Aunt Mimi as a sort of nightmare figure, bossy and humorless and that kind of thing. But of course, first John had this very flighty mother who then, when he was 17, died in a car accident. But but before that, he'd been living with Aunt Mimi. Aunt Mimi, the older sister, had looked after John. And obviously, if you're John before he was famous, you'd think, you know, this child is likely to go off the rails. This is, you know, he wasn't doing proper work at school. He was shoplifting, all that kind of stuff. So she was worried about him. And so she was very strict with him. And the funny thing is with John, though he often complained about his childhood, and he'd even complained about Aunt Mimi, right up to the end of his life, he was ringing her every week. He would write her letters. He said that one of the reasons when he was in New York, he didn't return to England because he was always terrified it would be the last time he'd see Aunt Mimi. Of course, he then predeceased her, but I think she was just what he needed. She bought him his first guitar as well. So she wasn't entirely, you know, she wasn't such a disciplinarian. She stopped him doing his music. But she would also, she was funny, I think. You know, she once wrote to a fan who'd written to her saying, and she had quite a long correspondence with this particular fan. She said, "Isn't it absurd the way John speaks with this absurd Liverpudlian accent?" I mean, John had a slight Liverpudlian accent, but he really exaggerated it on, you know, because he was the most middle class of the Beatles, actually. They all saw him as very posh, but he wanted to be the most working class, you know, like in that song he wrote after the Beatles, Working Class Hero. But it was always a slight affectation.
Greg, I want to understand, with the plethora or the ocean of writing on the Beatles out there, biographies, memoirs, coming as you are right off the back of a very successful book on Princess Margaret, why you would choose this subject? I mean, thank heavens you did, because like I said, I really love the book. Also, you know, I could go on and on, but we don't have the requisite time. What's really unique about this book is he talks about fan stories, genuine fans of the Beatles, and fans that the Beatles had become over the sands of time, how they were actually muted, a little nervous in front of Bob Dylan, Brigitte Bardot, for example, Elvis Presley. So why the book? Why 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time?
I wanted to do... Princess Margaret was a very, very kind of limited subject. You know, her life was quite limited. It didn't have much progress to it, you know, other than a slight downhill slant. And so it was possible to do a book sort of involving the whole of Princess Margaret. You could really kind of cover the subject with her. And no one had written about her in a sort of, you know, people had done scandalous books about her or very reverential books about her, but I just wanted to do her from every angle. And I did her in this slightly unusual way of lots of, rather like a kaleidoscope, seeing her from different angles, doing different things with each chapter, different ways of narration. And I wanted to do the same with the Beatles, who are obviously much more interesting in themselves. First, there are 4 of them, all have very different characters. And also they have this amazing arc or journey, you know, and coming from absolutely nowhere to within a few years becoming a kind of world-dominating force. And even, you know, Putin and both Putin and Gorbachev told Paul McCartney that they remembered the whole youth of Russia, of the Soviet Union, being altered by the Beatles because they became this emblem of a free society. And so the Beatles was a much, much bigger subject and therefore a longer book. But I wanted also to see them from different angles and to do same kind of funny things that I'd done with Princess Margaret. For instance, I have a chapter on what would have happened that Paul McCartney had, for one of his exams at school, he I think it was Latin, he failed by 5% or something, and because he failed, he stayed down a year at school, and because he stayed down a year, he was in the same class as George Harrison. So and there he became friends with George Harrison. So you can definitely say that George Harrison wouldn't have been a Beatle if Paul had worked a little bit harder at his Latin. There are lots of those strange coincidences and weird chances that went into the makeup of the Beatles. So I explore that kind of thing too. I just think the Beatles, especially, it was published, this year is 50 years since they broke up. And it is extraordinary that there's still this huge force in music. I think they re-released Abbey Road recently, and it was #1 straight away. People haven't, my children who are 30, they know all the Beatles songs. They're not avid Beatles fans, but they know all the songs. The songs, I think, will be with us forever now. And yet everyone thought, and the Beatles themselves thought in 1963, 64, everyone said at every press conference, someone would say, when will the bubble burst? And they thought it would. They had plans for the jobs they'd do afterwards. But of course, the bubble has never burst.
Very well said. Opportune moment for us to go into questions from all you wonderful people who've been watching us across all the platforms. Okay, questions for Craig Brown. Usha, and I'm so glad she brought this up because, we didn't manage to cover this during our extensive chat. Could Craig say something about their reception in and relationship with America? Now, I want to add to that, Craig, because you do say in the book, and you've actually quoted from press conferences on arrival at the first trip and the last trip to America, and the huge contrast between those two, because they had changed so much as individuals and humans, and they'd gone through so much in the intervening years that they'd been to America.
Yes. I think one of the great things about the Beatles is that they were always themselves. From this really, when they first went to America, they were sort of about 20, 21. They were very young, and you could see that on YouTube, press conferences at JFK Airport, and they are most people, certainly myself in that position, you'd be completely overawed by suddenly having to face a room full of, packed with journalists and these screaming fans and everything. But they just get on with having fun. They were so much a unit, and they loved. You can just tell from all those press conferences, they love being in this foursome, and it's them against the world, and they don't change their accents, they don't change their behavior, they're just full of kind of jokes and fun. And of course they were huge, sort of completely, much more so than in England. They were overnight success in America, having been on the Ed Sullivan TV show, completely changed America in lots of ways. But then I suppose it was only about 4 years later, John and Paul come back to launch Apple, and there's a sort of sourness about them and a weariness, and I think it's just I don't blame them, that the world had just become complicated. At the beginning, the world in '64 was simple, everything was excitement. Suddenly they hear, when they're in France, they hear that they're at the top of the charts in America. They then do this American tour, become the most famous people in America. And of course you get used to the thing about success, everyone gets used to it, and then they want something else. And I think by that time they wanted something else. They didn't quite know what it was. They weren't getting on nearly as well with each other. They'd lost Brian Epstein, so the apparatus around them. And they'd embarked on this rather ill-fated project of Apple. And so, yeah, so if you look also on YouTube, you can see the press conference they do. And it's, in fact, I think, I've got a feeling that Alex Mardas, you can see him in the corner, the Greek charlatan. He's in the corner, so you can see him. I think he's in a white suit. Yeah, and so they were surrounded by these, hangers-on. Yeah, so it came to an end. But I think and then 2 or 3 years later, the whole thing came to an end. But I think there's something actually rather, certainly from a writer's point of view, it's rather good to have a beginning and a middle and an end. The trouble with the Rolling Stones is that they've never ended. They're just a kind of tribute band to themselves. Whereas the Beatles, you know, they stopped when they should have stopped, I think.
This is Meher Marfatia. Meher says, I sang All You Need Is Love with my choir. And while I was learning to sing All You Need Is Love with my choir, I looked up this little nugget. George Martin, who wrote the orchestral arrangement, is supposed to have bunged in the French anthem at the top of the song as a friendly gesture to suggest that even the English could pull in the French. They're supposed to not be the chummiest with. We didn't talk of George Martin, and Meher goes on to say, Craig just tells us he was taught the oboe by Jane Asher's mother. So a bit about All You Need Is Love and, of course, George Martin.
Yes, I guess George Martin was unbelievably influential, and I can't remember, but I think it's very likely that he brought in the French national anthem because he was, you know, he had this amazing musical knowledge of both classical and pop, and he was always, especially with John, he wasn't very good at articulating what the effect or particularizing the effect that he wanted. He would. John would say something like, "Oh, I want to sound as if I'm in a space capsule or something," and George would work out what he meant. George Martin, and so it's likely. I don't know whether he did it to send out some subliminal message about England versus France. I slightly doubt that. But you can't. I wish I'd written more about George Martin in the book because. He was a fascinating figure. He came from actually a poorer. His background was as poor as Ringo, and Ringo's was the poorest of the Beatles. You know, they shared a toilet with 4 other people in the house. They only had a sink on a landing and that kind of thing. And then he went into the Royal Air Force, and became this rather kind of grand figure. And they all saw him. The Beatles all saw him as, you know, Mr. Martin, you know, as a smart figure. But actually, he'd come from origins as lowly as theirs.
Okay, this is from somebody who hasn't left their name. Could Craig tell us why they chose such an odd name for the band, the Beatles? Actually, Craig does mention it in the book, and I'm going to allow him to answer that. And there's a corollary to this question. What is your ultimate Beatles song, both of you? Well, I've got to say, for me, it's got to be a toss-up between Let It Be and Penny Lane. So, you know, that's me. I leave Craig to tell us about his choice of Beatles song and, of course, the name. How did it happen?
Yeah, well, my choice, it is very hard, and I suppose the thing is you don't have to make a choice, but I think mine would be Hey Jude if I had to have any. It still sort of sends tingles down my back, though I agree with your two as well, and I like I Am the Walrus. I like Strawberry Fields. I like, you know, I like 3/4 of them, really. The Beatles, they went through, I mean, now when you think Beatles, you know, if you think objectively, it is a really bad name. You know, this rather pathetic pun of, you know, I think there was a whole. It was like Buddy Holly and the Crickets. They loved Buddy Holly, and he had this group, the Crickets. So they were thinking we must have insects. So then they thought of the Beatles, and then one of them thought, oh well, we can put an A in, and it would be Beatles. But now actually, if you Google Beatles, you know, the insect, and Beatles the group, of course Beatles the group gets far more. So actually Beatles is now the way to spell the word. Beatles with an A is the way to spell the word Beatles. It's overtaken them. And of course in a way, like I was saying about lyrics, they become something different, however nonsensical and however bad a name the Beatles, you know, we no longer think of it as a peculiar name or as a, you know, a second-rate name. They are just the Beatles.
Lovely. And we've got to sign off with this last question, the absolute last one. What is the interest in the Beatles, and how does today's generation relate to them? timeless, really, isn't it? So, appropriate way to sign off this.
I think the way because I'm not one of the Beatles. I came to the Beatles when I was born in 1957, so I was sort of 10 when they started being a success. I didn't really get into them until Sgt. Pepper. But I can't really talk for the younger generation today. I do know some 15-year-olds who can play all the songs on guitar, you know, and are completely devoted to. And of course, there are Beatles tribute bands. There are something like 1,000 in the world, and some of them have been going for 40 years. So, and some now have to retire because they look too old to be Beatles. But it has. I mean, I think basically, Paul in particular had an amazing gift for melody. The combination with John, they're two entirely different characters, just sparked something off. They have very beautiful harmonies, you shouldn't forget, just as musicians. Ringo is a really good drummer, for instance. Their voices together were magical. I think almost all their songs together were better than almost all their songs apart. There was something about this combination of these four Liverpudlians which just created something magical and something lastingly magical.
Well, magical is a word that I could use for this session. Absolutely wondrous. Craig Brown, I had such an incredible time talking to you. We've got to wrap.
Easy, and thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And like I said, I urge all of you who are on this Tata Lit Live broadcast to go and pick up 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time, this excellent book that Craig has put out. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Craig Brown and Hrishi K, for those stories and the splendid conversation. It was nothing but a treat for us Beatle fans and the audience. Thank you so much. Dear audience, you can check out Mr. Craig Brown's book, 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time at tataclick.com. The next session that you can hop into is Writer Books at 7:15 p.m. India time. To know more about other sessions and debates and panel discussions, you can check out the festival schedule at tatalitlive.in. We'd like to thank our session sponsor, Citi, for this conversation. Hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you so much for being with us at Tata Literature Live. Have a wonderful evening.